"This is Maria. She helps around the house," my son casually remarked to his business associates gathered in my home, the home I had built from scratch after 40 years of teaching. I smiled politely and poured their coffee without correction. 2 weeks later, at the reading of my revised will, I slid a property management contract across the table to my stunned son. "Since you see me as the help, you can now pay market rate to live in my house, or you can find somewhere else to conduct your business meetings." The lawyer's office fell silent as my son finally understood the true cost of dismissing a woman who had educated generations of students and built her legacy without any man's permission. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I am Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, born in 1953 in the small town of Mapleton. For those quick with math, yes, that makes me 72 years old, though I've never been one to shy away from my age. Each year has been earned through experience, each wrinkle a reminder of either laughter or lessons, sometimes both. My story isn't unusual for women of my generation who chose to build something meaningful in a world that often preferred us to remain decorative and compliant. My parents were hardworking immigrants who arrived in this country with little more than determination and dreams for their children. My father worked double shifts at the local steel factory, while my mother cleaned houses for wealthy families and took in sewing to make ends meet. They couldn't provide material wealth, but they gave me something far more valuable, an unshakable belief in education as the key to unlocking any door. "Education is the one thing no one can ever take from you, Ellie," my mother would say as she reviewed my homework by lamplight after returning from a 12-hour workday. Her hands, rough from cleaning chemicals and constant labor, would gently turn the pages of my school books with a reverence reserved for sacred texts. "Your mind is your kingdom. Build it well." Those early lessons shaped my path in ways I couldn't imagine as a young girl practicing English pronunciation and memorizing mathematical formulas. I became the first in my family to graduate high school, then college, eventually earning my doctorate in educational psychology against odds that would have deterred someone with less stubborn determination. The framed diplomas on my study wall represent more than academic achievements. They're monuments to countless nights spent studying after teaching all day, to semesters when I survived on little more than coffee and sheer willpower, to years when I balanced single motherhood with professional advancement in institutions that weren't designed for women like me to succeed. My career in education spanned 42 years, beginning as an elementary school teacher in a neighborhood similar to the one where I grew up. Those early years taught me that education isn't merely about transferring information, it's about igniting possibility in young minds, especially those society has conditioned to expect little from themselves. Over decades, I advanced through various positions: curriculum developer, principal, district administrator, and finally, professor of education at the state university, where I trained new generations of teachers until my retirement 5 years ago. My research on multicultural learning methodologies has been implemented in school districts across 3 states. The teaching award displayed on my credenza represents one of my proudest achievements, not for the recognition itself, but for what it symbolizes: the thousands of students whose lives were touched by my work. My personal life followed a less conventional trajectory than my professional one. I married relatively young to Carlos, my college sweetheart whose dreams of becoming a renowned architect seemed perfectly aligned with my educational ambitions. We were going to change the world together, he through designing spaces that elevated human experience, I through nurturing minds that would inhabit those spaces. Reality proved more complicated. When our son Miguel was born in 1980, the weight of parenthood fell almost exclusively on my shoulders, despite our theoretical commitment to equal partnership. Carlos's career took precedence. His late nights at the office and weekend client meetings became the norm rather than the exception. I adjusted, as women often do, stretching myself thinner to accommodate everyone's needs, while pursuing my own goals in the margins of existence. Our marriage ended after 8 years, not with dramatic confrontation, but with mutual recognition that we had become strangers occupying the same address. The divorce was amicable by most standards. No contested assets, no custody battles. But the aftermath left me as a single mother with a young son and a career that demanded everything I had to give. Miguel became my world, my motivation for pushing through exhaustion, for continuing to climb professional ladders when it would have been easier to settle for less demanding positions. Every promotion meant better opportunities for him. Every salary increase represented future security. For our small family unit, I structured my life around providing him with advantages I never had. Private schools, music lessons, summer educational programs, and later, an elite university education without the burden of student loans. I never remarried, though not for lack of opportunities. My choice to remain single wasn't about loyalty to my ex-husband or disinterest in companionship. It was pragmatic prioritization. Between raising Miguel, advancing my career, and eventually caring for my aging parents, until their passing, there simply wasn't space for the emotional labor another relationship would require. I had learned early that women's time and energy are finite resources that must be allocated carefully. Miguel flourished under circumstances that might have disadvantaged another child. Being raised by a strong, independent mother taught him resilience and self-sufficiency. At least, that's what I believed for many years. He graduated with honors, secured an excellent position with a financial consulting firm, and married Sophia, an ambitious corporate attorney whose professional drive matched his own. Their twin daughters, my precious granddaughters Lucia and Isabella, are now 11 years old and showing the same intellectual curiosity that characterized my own childhood. The complex shift in our relationship began subtly after my retirement. Having dedicated my life to my career and his upbringing, I found myself suddenly untethered from the identities that had defined me for decades. The transition wasn't easy, but I approached it with the same methodical determination that had carried me through other life challenges. I sold my modest suburban home, the one I had purchased on my own after the divorce and maintained through decades of careful budgeting, and designed a new chapter that would balance my desire for continued purpose with well-earned comfort. With my retirement savings and the proceeds from the house sale, I purchased and renovated a beautiful historic home in Valleydale, a charming community with excellent cultural amenities and a university atmosphere that kept me intellectually stimulated. The Vernon House, as it was known locally, had fallen into disrepair after years of neglect. Where others saw decay, I saw potential, much like I had with struggling students throughout my career. The renovation became my new purpose, a project that honored both history and future possibility. I worked closely with preservation specialists to maintain the home's architectural integrity while modernizing systems and creating spaces that would serve multiple purposes. The front parlor became a small library housing my extensive collection of educational texts and literature. The formal dining room was designed to accommodate both family gatherings and the book club meetings I host monthly. The sunroom overlooking the gardens was transformed into my personal studio, where I write my memoirs and correspond with former students and colleagues who have become dear friends over decades. Most importantly, I created dedicated spaces for community contribution, a basement classroom equipped for tutoring disadvantaged students, and a guest suite for visiting scholars. Participating in the educational foundation I established with a portion of my retirement funds. The Eleanor Vasquez Education Access Initiative provides scholarships for first-generation college students pursuing teaching careers, my way of extending my life's work beyond my active years. This house represents everything I've built, literally and figuratively. Every detail reflects thoughtful intention, from the accessible bathroom features I incorporated with aging in mind to the custom bookshelves sized perfectly for my reference materials. This isn't merely a dwelling, but the physical manifestation of a life dedicated to education, independence, and forward thinking. Miguel and Sophia's relationship with my new home has been complicated from the beginning. They visit regularly, bringing my granddaughters for weekend stays and holiday celebrations. The girls delight in exploring the house's nooks and fascinating history, while I delight in sharing my knowledge and observing their developing minds. However, Miguel's attitude toward my independent choices has evolved in concerning ways since my retirement. Where he once celebrated my professional accomplishments and self-sufficiency, he now exhibits increasing paternalism disguised as concern. Comments about the house being too much for someone your age to manage began appearing in our conversations despite my robust health and careful planning for maintenance. Suggestions about more appropriate senior living options emerged despite my obvious contentment and continued active community engagement. This shift coincided with his own professional advancement to senior partnership at his firm, a position that apparently convinced him that his judgment should naturally supersede mine in all practical matters. The dynamic that emerged was both familiar and disturbing. The confident male authority figure convinced he knows better than the aging woman whose lifetime of demonstrated competence has somehow become invisible. I recognized the pattern from countless professional situations throughout my career. The gradual diminishment of female authority, the subtle questioning of capabilities based on nothing more than gender and age, rather than actual evidence of decline. That this was coming from my own son made it both more painful and more important to address effectively. The catalyzing incident occurred 3 months ago, when Miguel asked if he could host an important client meeting at my home. His firm's conference room was being renovated, and he thought the impressive historical architecture and elegant setting of the Vernon House would help secure a particularly significant contract. I agreed readily, pleased that he recognized the home's beauty and value, and happy to support his professional endeavors as I had throughout his life. I prepared meticulously for the gathering, ensuring the formal dining room was arranged appropriately for a business meeting. I baked fresh pastries, my mother's traditional recipes that had always been Miguel's favorites, and prepared coffee service with the fine china I reserved for special occasions. Though I didn't expect to participate in the business discussions, I took care with my appearance, selecting a simple but elegant outfit that reflected my position as the homeowner and Miguel's mother. When the clients arrived, 3 men and 2 women in impeccable business attire, Miguel made introductions with practiced charm. He presented his colleagues by name and title, noted the client's companies and positions with appropriate deference, and then, turning to me as I arranged the coffee service, said casually, "This is Maria. She helps around the house. Maria, could you bring more cream when you have a moment?" The room didn't fall silent. No one gasped dramatically. Business conversation continued seamlessly because nothing extraordinary had occurred from their perspective. Just a wealthy professional acknowledging household staff. But in that moment, 42 years of educational accomplishment, a doctorate, countless academic publications, and a lifetime of breaking barriers disappeared completely. I became invisible in my own home, transformed from Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, respected educator and homeowner, into Maria, a nameless domestic worker whose only identity was service to the important people in the room. What struck me most wasn't that Miguel had failed to introduce me as his mother. That might have been excusable as a boundary between personal and professional spheres. It was that he had completely erased my identity, even inventing a different name that conveniently matched stereotypical expectations for household help in our community. The casual racism and classism embedded in this choice was especially painful coming from someone I had raised to recognize and respect human dignity regardless of position. In that moment, I had choices. I could have corrected him immediately, embarrassing him professionally while asserting my identity. I could have refused to continue serving coffee, creating awkward tension that would have undermined his business objectives. I could have expressed hurt or anger, centering my emotional response in a situation he had defined as professionally important. Instead, I smiled politely, poured their coffee without correction, and continued playing the role he had assigned, me. Not because I accepted it, but because I recognized that the appropriate response required more strategic thinking than immediate reaction. This wasn't merely about one thoughtless moment, but about fundamental respect and recognition of worth that needed addressing at its roots rather than its symptoms. Throughout the 3-hour meeting, I performed the role of Maria with meticulous attention to detail. I served refreshments, cleared used cups, brought additional materials when requested. I observed the business dynamics with the same analytical mind that had served me through decades of navigating educational politics and institutional hierarchies, and I made mental notes about every participant, every contract detail casually mentioned, every negotiation strategy employed. When the meeting concluded and the visitors departed with handshakes and promises of continued discussion, Miguel turned to me with the satisfied expression of someone who believes they've achieved an important objective. "That went perfectly," he declared, loosening his tie with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to success. "Having the meeting here definitely impressed them." Johnson mentioned the elegant historic setting specifically. I nodded, still clearing coffee cups with efficient movements. "The Vernon House creates quite an impression." "We should do this more often," he continued, checking messages on his phone rather than meeting my eyes. "My office renovation is taking forever, and this environment is perfect for the client demographic we're targeting. I could set up regular meetings here, maybe twice monthly. I'd compensate you for your time, of course." The casual presumption that my home existed as an extension of his professional resources, and that I naturally existed as an extension of my home's amenities, crystallized everything that needed addressing in our relationship. This wasn't merely about one thoughtless introduction, but about fundamental misalignment in how he had come to perceive my value, autonomy, and identity. "I'll need to check my schedule," I responded neutrally, knowing my calendar was not the determining factor in my decision. "We can discuss possibilities later." He left shortly afterward, still riding the satisfaction of what he perceived as professional triumph, completely unaware that the foundation of our relationship had fundamentally shifted during those 3 hours. Not because of what he had done, but because of what his actions had revealed about how he truly saw me. Not as Dr. Eleanor Vasquez with her own identity and accomplishments, but as an extension of himself and his needs, a supporting character in his life narrative rather than the protagonist of my own. That evening, after he'd gone, I sat in my study surrounded by the diplomas, awards, and photographs that documented a lifetime of breaking barriers and creating meaningful impact. I thought about my mother's rough hands turning textbook pages, about her unwavering belief that education creates a kingdom no one can take from you. I thought about the thousands of students whose lives I had touched, many now successful professionals, who still wrote to share how my influence had shaped their paths. And I thought about my son, who had somehow missed the most fundamental lesson I had tried to teach by example, that every person deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not for what convenience might wish them to be. The solution came with surprising clarity. This wasn't about punishment or retaliation, but about necessary recalibration, establishing boundaries that would force recognition of reality rather than allowing continued comfortable delusion. With methodical precision, I began drafting documents that would transform abstract disrespect into concrete consequences requiring thoughtful response. First, I contacted my attorney, Ms. Rebecca Goldman, who had handled my legal affairs for decades and understood both my values and my practical approach to difficult situations. I requested an immediate appointment to revise my will and establish new property arrangements. Her response was prompt and without judgment, the professional respect I had come to expect from those with whom I had built authentic relationships. Next, I researched current market rates for executive meeting spaces in our community, compiling detailed information about comparable historic properties used for corporate functions. The Vernon house's architectural significance and custom amenities placed it at the premium end of the scale, information that would prove relevant to the documents I was preparing. Finally, I drafted a property use contract outlining specific terms for any future business activities conducted in my home. The language was precise, the conditions explicit, the financial considerations thoroughly researched. This wasn't emotional reaction, but strategic response, the approach that had served me through decades of institutional negotiations and administrative challenges. 2 weeks later, I invited Miguel to join me at Ms. Goldman's office for what I described as an important discussion about future arrangements. His response suggested mild curiosity but no particular concern, the casual confidence of someone who assumes they understand the parameters of all possible interactions. The tastefully appointed conference room at the law offices provided the perfect setting for what would follow. Ms. Goldman greeted us with professional courtesy, offering no indication that what was about to transpire diverged from standard legal proceedings. Miguel took his seat with the relaxed posture of someone who anticipates routine business rather than transformative confrontation. As Ms. Goldman outlined the revisions to my will and estate planning, Miguel's expression remained politely attentive but largely unengaged until she reached the section concerning the Vernon house and its disposition. The property he had assumed would naturally transfer to him as primary heir was now designated as the future headquarters of the Eleanor Vasquez Education Access Initiative, with specific provisions ensuring it would continue serving its community. Education mission in perpetuity. His posture shifted, attention suddenly focused as the implications became clear. Before he could fully process this information, Ms. Goldman smoothly transitioned to the second order of business, the property use agreement that would govern any future professional activities conducted in my home during my lifetime. This was the moment when I slid the contract across the table, watching comprehension dawn in his expression as he scanned the document's title. Executive Meeting Space Rental Agreement. Since you see me as the help, you can now pay market rate to use my house for your business meetings, or you can find somewhere else to conduct them, I stated quietly. The contract includes detailed terms for space rental, catering services, and administrative support, all at current market value for premium executive venues. You're welcome to review it with your own attorney before deciding whether these arrangements meet your professional needs. The lawyer's office fell silent as my son finally understood the true cost of dismissing a woman who had educated generations of students and built her legacy without any man's permission, even his. His reaction in that moment, and what followed in the months after our confrontation, revealed character dimensions I hadn't fully recognized until circumstances forced them into the open. But that part of the story deserves its own telling, with the context now established for how we arrived at this pivotal moment of truth between mother and son. Sometimes respect must be taught through consequences when examples and expectations have somehow failed to convey the message. Not with anger or vindictiveness, but with clear boundaries that mirror back the reality of how one person has chosen to see another. Next time, I'll share what happened after that moment in the lawyer's office, how Miguel responded to this unexpected recalibration of our relationship, and how the contract became the beginning of a difficult but necessary journey toward authentic recognition between us. Until then, remember that your value exists independently of others' perception, but sometimes, those perceptions require correction through actions rather than words. The most powerful lesson often comes not from what we say, but from what we refuse to accept. If this resonates with your experience, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to establish boundaries with someone who couldn't see your true value? How did you handle that moment of necessary truth? Your stories might help others finding their own voice in similar situations. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear the next chapter in this journey. And remember, becoming invisible is always a choice, never an obligation, no matter your age. The lawyer's office remained silent as Miguel stared at the contract before him, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and the dawning realization that this was no misunderstanding. His fingers tensed against the heavy paper, creating small wrinkles in the professionally drafted document that outlined in precise terms exactly what his casual dismissal of my identity had cost him. "Is this some kind of joke?" he finally asked. His voice pitched slightly higher than normal, the same tone he had used as a teenager when confronted with unexpected consequences for his actions. "No," I replied simply. "It's a business proposal based on how you chose to define our relationship. During your meeting, as Maria, I provide household services for which you should expect to pay market rate. As your mother, I would have hosted your meeting as family support, but you made it clear which role you prefer me to occupy." Ms. Goldman, ever the consummate professional, maintained a neutral expression as she quietly added, "The terms are quite standard for executive meeting spaces of comparable quality. We researched current market rates thoroughly." Miguel's gaze shifted between us, perhaps hoping to detect some sign that this was an elaborate lesson rather than a legally binding document requiring response. Finding none, he attempted a different approach. "Mom, if I said something that upset you, we should discuss it privately, not involve legal documentation." "This isn't about being upset," I corrected him. "It's about alignment. You've positioned me as household staff rather than homeowner. I'm simply formalizing the arrangement you created so expectations are clear on both sides." His expression tightened as he realized emotional appeals wouldn't resolve the situation. The businessman in him emerged, scanning the document more carefully, assessing terms and implications with professional detachment. $1,500 per meeting? That's extravagant even for premium venues. The rate includes personalized catering, administrative support, and exclusive use of a historically significant property, Ms. Goldman explained, her tone suggesting this was entirely reasonable. Comparable spaces with less distinguished architectural features command similar rates, particularly with the level of personal service provided. Miguel set the contract down and turned to me directly, attempting to establish the parent-child connection that had momentarily disappeared beneath our newly defined relationship. "What is this really about? If I've done something to offend you, just tell me directly." The question revealed the fundamental disconnect that had led us to this moment. He genuinely couldn't identify his action as problematic without explicit explanation, evidence of how normalized such dismissals had become in his worldview. This wasn't merely about one thoughtless introduction, but about a pattern of diminishment that had developed so gradually he remained unaware of its existence. "You introduced me as Maria to your business associates," I stated calmly. "You assigned me a fictional identity as household help, rather than acknowledging me as Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, the homeowner and your mother. This wasn't a slip of the tongue, but a deliberate choice that revealed how you've come to perceive me as an extension of domestic services rather than a person with my own identity and accomplishments." His expression suggested genuine surprise at the significance I attached to what he had clearly viewed as a trivial matter. "It was just easier for the business context," he attempted to explain. "Introducing you as my mother would have seemed unprofessional, and your academic credentials weren't relevant to the meeting. Yet you found it necessary to give me a different name entirely," I observed. "Not Eleanor, or even no name at all, but Maria, a name with specific cultural connotations in the context of household service." A flush spread across his face as the implications of this choice became impossible to ignore. For perhaps the first time, he was forced to confront the casual prejudices embedded in his professional performance, assumptions about who merits recognition and who remains conveniently unnamed. "I didn't intend it that way," he insisted, though his expression suggested dawning recognition that impact matters more than intent in such situations. "Nevertheless," I continued, "you made a choice that defined our relationship in a specific way. The contract merely formalizes that definition with appropriate compensation for the role you assigned me. Miguel glanced at his watch, a habitual gesture when conversations become uncomfortable, and attempted to regain control of the situation. I have another meeting scheduled. Can I take this with me to review the terms? Of course, Ms. Goldman replied. Take whatever time you need to consider the agreement. Dr. Vasquez has also indicated she's open to discussing alternative arrangements if you prefer not to utilize her home for business purposes in the future. With forced composure, Miguel gathered the contract and placed it in his leather portfolio. His movements were precise, controlled, the physical discipline masking emotional turmoil in the way I had observed throughout his childhood when facing difficult situations. We'll discuss this at a more appropriate time, he stated as he stood to leave, attempting to reestablish the parent-child hierarchy through tone alone. I'm available whenever you'd like to continue the conversation, I responded with the professional courtesy I would extend to any business associate. Just call my assistant to arrange a convenient time. The reference wasn't lost on him. I had no assistant, but the subtle reminder of his Maria fabrication landed precisely as intended. With a terse nod, he departed, leaving Ms. Goldman and me alone in the conference room. That went about as expected, she observed once the door closed behind him. Yes, I agreed. Change rarely comes without resistance, especially when it challenges comfortable assumptions. Do you think he'll sign the agreement? She asked, her tone suggesting professional curiosity rather than doubt about my approach. Eventually, in some form, I predicted. Miguel values his image too much to create open conflict, and he needs the meeting space for his business objectives. The question is whether he'll recognize the deeper issue or merely adapt to the new transactional parameters. As we gathered our materials to depart, Ms. Goldman offered one final observation. It's remarkable how often people mistake setting boundaries for creating conflict, when boundaries are actually what prevent deeper conflicts from developing. Precisely, I agreed. Some lessons can only be taught through consequences when examples have failed to convey the message. The following week passed without communication from Miguel, the silence itself forming a response more revealing than any immediate reaction might have been. This pattern wasn't unfamiliar in our relationship. When confronted with difficult emotions, he typically withdrew until he had processed sufficiently to present a composed response. The trait had served him well professionally, but created distance in personal relationships that required authentic vulnerability. I continued with my regular activities, tutoring sessions with scholarship students, foundation board meetings, community volunteer work, maintaining the purposeful routine that had characterized my retirement years. The emotional weight of our confrontation existed alongside these commitments rather than displacing them. Compartmentalization being another skill honed through decades of balancing professional demands with personal challenges. 10 days after our meeting at the lawyer's office, Miguel's name appeared on my caller ID. I answered with neutral cordiality, offering no indication of expectation or assumption about his purpose. I've reviewed the contract, he stated without preamble. We should discuss the terms in person. Are you available for dinner tomorrow evening? Sophia will be working late. So it would be just us. The suggestion of a private dinner, creating space for conversation without witnesses to potential disagreement, indicated his preference for resolving family conflicts away from external observation. This wasn't necessarily manipulation, but rather his consistent approach to maintaining the polished image he presented professionally. Dinner would be fine, I agreed. Would you prefer to come here or meet at a restaurant? The slight hesitation before his response suggested recognition of the power dynamics embedded in location choice. Your home would be best since we'll be discussing the property agreement. 6 o'clock then, I confirmed. I'll prepare something simple. The measured calm of our exchange belied the significance of what would follow, a conversation that would either reinforce the boundaries I had established or reveal whether deeper recognition was possible beyond mere adaptation to changed circumstances. The tea. Following evening, I prepared a meal of significance rather than extravagance. My mother's traditional paella recipe that had marked important family occasions throughout Miguel's childhood. The familiar flavors might serve as subtle reminder of continuity amid changing relationships, of values transmitted across generations despite evolving contexts. The dining room table was set with appropriate formality, but in the smaller breakfast area rather than the grand formal space, creating an atmosphere conducive to meaningful conversation rather than performative interaction. Miguel arrived precisely, at 6, bearing an expensive bottle of wine and a carefully neutral expression. His appearance was less formally business-oriented than usual. Cashmere sweater replacing suit jacket, absence of tie suggesting personal rather than professional. Engagement. Though the carefully coordinated ensemble still reflected his attention to presentation in all contexts. "Something smells familiar," he observed as he entered, recognition softening his features momentarily. "Abuela's paella," I confirmed. It seemed appropriate for an important discussion. A flicker of emotion crossed his face, perhaps remembering childhood moments when this meal had accompanied significant conversations, or recognition that I was acknowledging the gravity of our current situation through this culinary choice. He handed me the wine with a gesture that managed to convey both peace offering and maintenance of standards simultaneously. "Rioja," he noted. I remembered it pairs well with the saffron. The small acknowledgement of shared history provided tentative foundation for what would follow. We moved through preliminary conversation with practiced ease, brief updates on his daughter's activities, observations about recent community events, comments on mutual acquaintances, the social lubrication that family members develop to maintain. Connection across difficult terrain. It wasn't until we had finished the main course that Miguel finally addressed the purpose of our meeting. Setting down his wine glass with deliberate precision, he extracted a folder from his leather messenger bag and placed it on the table between us. "I've had our legal team review the contract," he began, his tone suggesting professional assessment, rather than personal response. "They've proposed some modifications that might better serve both our interests while addressing your concerns." The approach was characteristic, transforming emotional confrontation into negotiable business transaction, territory where he felt confident and competent rather than vulnerable. I accepted the folder without immediate comment, noting the neatly annotated document inside with proposed amendments highlighted in different colors. "I'll review their suggestions," I responded, matching his professional tone. "But I'd be more interested in hearing your personal reflections on why this agreement became necessary in the first place." The question shifted terrain from comfortable transaction to more challenging introspection. Exactly the movement that was necessary if any meaningful change would emerge from our conflict. Miguel's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, as he recognized the redirection. "I've given that considerable thought," he admitted after a moment's consideration. "My initial reaction was that you were overreacting to something insignificant, a casual introduction that held no deeper meaning. But I've come to recognize there was something problematic in how I presented you to my colleagues. The acknowledgement, however tentative, represented progress beyond defensive justification." I remained silent, allowing space for him to continue without guidance or interruption. "I'm still not sure I fully understand the magnitude of your response," he continued carefully. "Creating legal documents and revising your will seems disproportionate to a thoughtless moment, but I recognize that introducing you as household staff rather than as the homeowner was disrespectful, regardless of my intentions." His framing still positioned the incident as isolated misstep rather than symptom of deeper pattern, progress, but in complete recognition of the fundamental issue. Rather than immediately challenging this limitation, I chose to explore it through questions that might lead to his own discoveries. "Why do you think you chose that particular introduction?" I asked. "Of all the possible ways to present me in that moment, what led to that specific choice?" The question visibly unsettled him, Moving from acknowledgement of error to examination of underlying motivations represented more threatening territory. He took a sip of wine, buying moments to formulate response. Expediency, primarily, he offered finally. It simplified the social dynamics of the meeting to position you as staff rather than family or property owner. Having to explain our relationship would have created unnecessary complexity in a business context. And why specifically Maria rather than no name at all? Or my actual name? I pressed gently. The flush that spread across his face suggested recognition of dimensions he had previously avoided confronting. That was unfortunate word choice, he conceded. I wasn't consciously thinking about cultural implications, but I can see how it reflected certain assumptions that I should examine more carefully. What do you imagine those assumptions might reveal if examined thoroughly? I continued, using the Socratic method that had served me throughout my teaching career, guiding discovery rather than imposing conclusions. Miguel's discomfort became increasingly evident as the conversation moved further from transactional negotiation toward personal reflection. His posture stiffened, fingers absently adjusting his watch band. Physical tells I had observed since his childhood when conversations approached emotional territory he preferred to avoid. I suppose, he began, then paused to recalibrate. Perhaps there's been a shift in how I've come to perceive your role since your retirement. When you were actively teaching and publishing, your professional identity was constantly evident. Since you've stepped back from that public role, I may have unconsciously begun viewing you primarily through your relationship to me, rather than as an individual with your own distinct identity and accomplishments. The insight, however tentative, represented meaningful progress, recognition of the gradual diminishment that had characterized his perception without requiring explicit confrontation about age or gender bias that might have triggered defensive retreat. I nodded encouragement, allowing him space to develop this emerging awareness. Looking back, I can see a pattern in my comments about the house being too much for you to manage, or suggestions about retirement communities being more appropriate, despite your obvious competence and contentment here, he continued. Connections. Forming as he spoke. I positioned myself as the practical authority, making responsible recommendations, rather than respecting your demonstrated ability to make sound decisions about your own life. Yes, I acknowledged simply. That pattern has become increasingly pronounced over the past year. The Maria introduction was just the most obvious manifestation of something that had been developing more subtly, he concluded, genuine realization evident in his expression. I've been relating to you as a dependent requiring management, rather than as an autonomous individual with significant accomplishments and continued capability. The moment of recognition created opening for deeper understanding than the contract alone could have forced. Rather than merely adapting to changed financial arrangements while maintaining underlying assumptions, Miguel was beginning to perceive the fundamental issue that had necessitated such dramatic intervention. I'm curious about when this shift began, I prompted. Can you identify when you started seeing me differently? His brow furrowed in concentration as he considered the question. I think it might have coincided with my promotion to senior partnership. As my professional authority expanded, I perhaps unconsciously began extending that authority into areas where it wasn't appropriate, including our relationship. That timing seems significant, I observed. Success can sometimes create distorted perception of one's judgment extending beyond its legitimate sphere. The contract was never really about the money or the meeting space, was it? He asked, understanding finally dawning. It was about forcing me to see what I was doing before. The pattern became irreversible. Essentially, yes, I confirmed. When patterns of diminishment remain unchallenged, they eventually become accepted as natural by both parties. The contract created concrete consequences that couldn't be dismissed as emotional overreaction or generational sensitivity. Miguel nodded slowly, absorbing implications that extended beyond our immediate situation. I wonder how many of my colleagues relate to their parents in similar ways without recognizing the pattern, he mused. Or how I might unconsciously apply the same diminishment to others whose capabilities I've discounted based on assumptions rather than evidence. This extension of insight from personal mistake to systemic pattern suggested potential for meaningful change rather than mere compliance with revised expectations. The educator in me recognized a teachable moment that had emerged not through lecture but through guided discovery, the most effective approach for lasting transformation. "So where does this leave us regarding the contract?" he asked finally, businessman re-emerging alongside more personal awareness. "That depends on how you'd like to define our relationship moving forward," I replied. "The agreement simply established clear parameters based on how you positioned me to others. If that positioning changes, perhaps the formal arrangement becomes unnecessary. I'd prefer we return to a family relationship rather than a business arrangement," he stated, sincerity evident in his tone. "But I also understand why you felt it necessary to create these boundaries after what happened. Perhaps we could establish a transition period," I suggested. "You've proposed modifications to the contract that your legal team considers appropriate. We could implement those for a defined time frame while rebuilding trust and demonstrating changed perspective through actions rather than just words." The proposal offered practical framework for moving forward while acknowledging that genuine transformation requires consistent demonstration rather than momentary insight. Miguel considered it thoughtfully before responding. "That seems reasonable," he agreed. "Actions matter more than intentions or temporary realizations. I need to consistently demonstrate that I see you accurately rather than through convenient assumptions." "Exactly," I confirmed. "Relationship patterns develop gradually and require equally deliberate reconstruction when damaged." We spent the IDM next hour reviewing his legal team's proposed modifications to the contract. Some reasonable adjustments to scheduling parameters and service specifications that reflected legitimate business considerations rather than attempts to undermine the fundamental agreement. The discussion remained collegial, balancing professional considerations with the personal understanding that had emerged through our conversation. As Miguel prepared to leave later that evening, he paused at the door with uncharacteristic hesitation. "I keep thinking about those clients," he admitted, "about how easily they accepted the introduction without question, because it aligned with their expectations about who serves and who is served in professional settings. I contributed to reinforcing those assumptions in ways I hadn't considered before. The observation revealed deeper recognition than I had initially hoped for, extending beyond our personal relationship to broader social patterns that his professional position either challenged or reinforced. Rather than immediate response, I allowed space for him to develop this emerging awareness. "I've scheduled a meeting with our diversity consultant next week," he continued after a moment. "I realized there might be similar blind spots in how I'm relating to colleagues and employees that warrant examination. This situation has made me question other assumptions I've been operating under without conscious awareness. This unexpected extension, applying personal insight to professional contexts where his influence affected many others, suggested possibility for impact beyond our immediate relationship. Without overstating its significance, I acknowledge the potential value of this broader application." "That seems like a thoughtful approach," I observed. "Personal awareness often has implications that extend beyond individual relationships." Miguel nodded, seeming to understand that I was neither effusively praising this step nor dismissing it as insufficient. "I'll have my assistant contact you about scheduling the next business meeting under the revised contract terms," he said, maintaining the professional framework we had established while acknowledging its temporary nature. "And perhaps we could have dinner again next week, just as family rather than to discuss business matters." "I'd enjoy that," I replied truthfully. "The girls are always welcome too if their schedule permits." As his car disappeared down the driveway, I reflected on the evening's conversation with measured optimism. The contract had served its intended purpose, creating concrete consequences that forced recognition of patterns too easily dismissed when presented as merely emotional concerns. Whether this recognition would translate to sustained change remained to be seen, but the foundation had been established for possibility rather than continued diminishment. Over the following months, our relationship underwent careful reconstruction, not returning to previous patterns but establishing new dynamics grounded in mutual respect rather than unconscious hierarchy. Miguel honored the contract terms precisely, paying market rate, for the 3 business meetings he scheduled at my home during the transition period we had established. More significantly, he began introducing me accurately to colleagues and clients who visited, not overcompensating with elaborate explanations of my credentials, but simply acknowledging me as my mother, Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, with the same professional respect he extended to other accomplished individuals in his circle. The most meaningful changes appeared in subtle interactions rather than dramatic gestures. Comments about the house being too much to manage disappeared completely. Suggestions about senior living options were replaced by genuine questions about my current projects and foundation activities. Most importantly, the unconscious paternalism that had characterized his attitude gave way to authentic interest in my perspective, not merely tolerated, but actively sought in matters where my experience might offer valuable insight. One particularly revealing moment occurred approximately 3 months after our confrontation, when Miguel called to discuss a potential educational initiative his firm was considering as part of their community engagement program. Rather than presenting predetermined plans for approval, he began by asking thoughtful questions about my experience with similar programs during my administrative career. We're considering partnerships with local schools to establish internship pathways for students from underrepresented communities, he explained. But I'm concerned about creating sustainable structures rather than superficial outreach that looks good in press releases but doesn't create lasting impact. Your foundation has maintained impressive retention rates with scholarship recipients, and I thought you might have insights about effective support systems. The consultation request represented significant evolution from previous interactions, recognition of specific expertise I possessed, rather than general deference to parental authority or dismissal of retired professional capacity. We spent nearly an hour discussing program structures, mentorship components, and assessment metrics that might create meaningful opportunities rather than token initiatives. This is extremely helpful, he acknowledged as our conversation concluded. Would you be willing to review our draft proposal once it's developed? Your perspective would be valuable, particularly regarding the educational continuity components. I'd be happy to, I agreed, professional satisfaction emerging from being engaged for relevant expertise rather than familial obligation. The Foundation Board might also have suggestions about potential educational partners with compatible objectives. Sophia, Miguel's wife, demonstrated parallel evolution in her interactions, though our relationship had always maintained more consistent respect than his had recently shown. During a weekend visit with my granddaughters, she mentioned noticing changes in Miguel's professional approach beyond our family context. He's become much more attentive to how we present ourselves institutionally, she observed as we watched the girls exploring the garden, questioning assumptions about who gets highlighted in corporate materials, whose contributions receive recognition. The marketing department is somewhat bewildered by his sudden interest in representation issues. She smiled slightly before adding, he mentioned a contract that made him rethink certain perspectives. I gathered there had been some significant conversation between you. We found it necessary to clarify certain boundaries, I acknowledged, without elaborating details he might have chosen to keep private. Sometimes formal agreements help establish parameters that informal understanding hasn't maintained. Whatever it was, she replied with characteristic directness. It prompted useful reflection beyond just your relationship. He's asking better questions about patterns that have been normalized throughout the organization, This extension of impact beyond our immediate relationship represented the most hopeful outcome of what had begun as painful confrontation, not merely correcting individual behavior, but prompting examination of systemic patterns that affected many others through institutional policies and practices. As the 6-month transition period we had established approached its conclusion, Miguel requested another private dinner to discuss next steps regarding our formal agreement. He arrived carrying not only the customary wine, but also a slender document folder that suggested continued attention to business matters, despite our improved personal interactions. After preliminary conversation, he placed the folder on the table between us, a gesture reminiscent of our previous negotiations but with notably different energy. "I've been thinking about our contract," he began, "and what happens when our agreed transition period ends next week." "As have I acknowledged. Do you have specific proposals to discuss?" He nodded, opening the folder to reveal not another legal document but a formal letter on his company's executive stationery. "This is my official notification that Bennett Financial Advisors will not be renewing the meeting space agreement upon its expiration. We've secured appropriate conference facilities at our new office location, effective immediately." The statement was delivered with professional courtesy rather than emotional manipulation. Recognition of changed circumstances rather than attempt to leverage improved relationship against business boundaries. I accepted the letter with equivalent professionalism, acknowledging its proper form with an appreciative nod. "However," he continued, extracting a second document from the folder, "I've been considering how to appropriately recognize what our recent interactions have taught me about perception, assumption, and recognition of value beyond conventional metrics." The second document revealed itself as a substantial donation pledge to the Eleanor Vasquez Education Access Initiative, not positioned as replacement for rental fees or emotional compensation, but as aligned support for work he had come to genuinely value through renewed attention to its significance. The firm's community foundation would like to establish an annual scholarship for first-generation college students pursuing education degrees, he explained. The selection committee would operate independently under your foundation's existing guidelines with no corporate influence on recipient selection beyond the basic eligibility requirements. The proposal demonstrated authentic evolution rather than strategic appeasement, supporting educational access based on genuine recognition of its importance rather than merely adjusting behavior to maintain comfortable relationship. Most significantly, it respected the foundation's established expertise rather than attempting to impose external control through financial leverage. That would be a meaningful contribution, I acknowledged, reviewing the specifics with professional assessment rather than maternal gratitude. The board would need to evaluate the proposed terms, of course, but the alignment with our mission seems appropriate. Of course, he agreed readily. They should apply the same due diligence as with any potential partnership. I've included contact information for our foundation director, who can address any questions about financial distributions and reporting requirements. The exchange continued with thoughtful discussion of practical implementation rather than emotional symbolism. Evidence that our relationship had established new foundation based on mutual professional respect alongside familial connection. When business matters concluded, conversation shifted naturally to family topics, with Miguel sharing recent developments in his daughter's activities and Sophia's professional advancement with evident pride and engagement. As evening concluded, he addressed directly what remained implicit in our earlier discussion. "I want to thank you for having the courage to establish consequences when necessary," he said, unusual vulnerability evident in his expression. "It would have been easier to simply accept the disrespect and maintain comfortable patterns, but nothing would have changed if you had. Growth rarely occurs within comfortable boundaries," I observed. "Sometimes the most valuable lessons come through experiences we would never have chosen." "I'm still learning from this one," he acknowledged. "Still discovering assumptions that have shaped my perception, not just of you, but of others whose capabilities I've discounted based on convenient categories rather than demonstrated reality. The admission suggested continuing evolution rather than completed transformation, the most realistic outcome one could hope for from confrontation that challenged deeply embedded patterns. Not perfection, but progress. Not complete resolution, but commitment to ongoing examination. As I watched his departing car from the porch of the home whose ownership had catalyzed our conflict, I reflected on the journey from that moment of casual dismissal to our current re-established relationship. The contract that had seemed so dramatic when presented had served its essential purpose, creating concrete consequences that required thoughtful response rather than mere emotional reaction or temporary appeasement. My son had introduced me as the maid, revealing patterns of diminishment too easily dismissed as innocent oversight. I had said nothing in that moment, choosing strategic response over immediate confrontation. Then I had handed him a contract that transformed abstract disrespect into tangible consequences requiring genuine engagement. The outcome wasn't perfect, resolution or complete transformation, but something more realistic and ultimately more valuable. Recognition of patterns that extended beyond our individual relationship into institutional structures affecting many others. The boundary established through formal agreement had created necessary space for recognition that informal understanding had failed to maintain. Sometimes respect must be taught through consequences when examples and expectations have somehow failed to convey the message. Not with anger or vindictiveness, but with clear boundaries that mirror back the reality of how one person has chosen to see another, and the cost of continuing to maintain that distorted vision when reality demonstrates otherwise. Year after the contract that formalized boundaries my son had failed to recognize through more subtle means, I stood in the auditorium of Westridge Community College, watching students receive the first scholarships awarded through the Bennett Financial Education Initiative. The 5 recipients, all first-generation college students pursuing teaching degrees, represented precisely the population my foundation had been established to support. Their presence on stage, accepting resources that would significantly impact their educational journeys, reflected how confrontation that begins with personal dignity can ultimately extend to benefit many beyond the initial conflict. Miguel stood at the podium delivering remarks that demonstrated continuing evolution in his perspective since that pivotal moment in the lawyer's office. His words were not merely performative philanthropy, but reflected genuine recognition of systemic patterns that his professional position either reinforced or challenged. Access to education remains profoundly unequal in our society, he stated with the measured authority that characterized his public speaking. As financial professionals, we have responsibility to examine how capital flows either maintain these barriers or help dismantle them. This initiative, guided by the expertise of educators who understand these challenges firsthand, represents commitment to addressing structural inequities rather than merely celebrating individual exceptions. The language revealed ongoing transformation, progression, from personal recognition regarding our relationship to broader understanding of how power operates through institutional structures. Without directly referencing our private confrontation, he had integrated its lessons into professional practice that affected resource allocation beyond our family dynamics. Watching from my seat in the second row, I felt satisfaction that transcended maternal pride or personal vindication. The boundary established through formal agreement had created necessary space for recognition that informal understanding had failed to maintain, but the true value emerged in how that recognition extended beyond our individual relationship to influence institutional practices affecting many others. After the ceremony concluded, I observed Miguel engaging with scholarship recipients and their families, not with the condescending beneficence that often characterizes wealthy donors, interacting with those they support, but with authentic interest in their educational journeys and career aspirations. His questions reflected understanding that their perspectives offered valuable insight rather than merely opportunities for philanthropic self-satisfaction. Sophia joined me as we watched this interaction from a slight distance, her professional assessment evident in her expression. "He's not the same executive who would have approached this opportunity a year ago," she observed quietly. "There's substantive difference in how he engages with programs like this, asking different questions, considering different metrics for success. Evolution occurs gradually, but reveals itself in specific moments," I replied. "Professional identity often resists examination until something disrupts its comfortable assumptions." She nodded thoughtfully before adding, "The company's diversity initiatives have shifted significantly under his influence as well. Less focus on superficial representation metrics, more attention to decision-making structures and advancement pathways. The executive committee initially resisted some recommendations, but his persistence is gradually shifting institutional culture. This extension of impact beyond our immediate relationship represented the most hopeful outcome of what had begun as painful confrontation, not merely correcting individual behavior, but catalyzing examination of systemic patterns that affected many others through institutional policies and practices. The contract that had seemed so dramatic when presented had ultimately served a purpose far beyond our family dynamics. Later that evening, Miguel, Sophia, and my granddaughters joined me for dinner at the Vernon house, now a comfortable family, gathering rather than tension-laden negotiation or performance of reconciliation. The girls, now 12, moved through the historical home with familiarity and appreciation, their interests reflecting both inherited family traits and unique emerging identities. Lucia, scientifically inclined and methodical, had become fascinated with the architectural preservation aspects of the property, regularly documenting restoration details in her meticulously maintained notebook. Isabella, more artistically oriented, often brought sketchbooks to capture the home's distinctive features from various perspectives. Both engaged with the space as meaningful environment rather than merely backdrop for family obligation. Evidence that values could indeed transmit across generations when consistently demonstrated rather than merely proclaimed. As we shared a meal in the dining room that had once hosted that fateful business meeting, conversation flowed naturally across topics professional and personal, the artificial boundaries between these domains gradually dissolving as our relationship stabilized, in new configurations based on mutual respect rather than assumed hierarchy. The Foundation Board approved expanding the tutoring program next semester, I mentioned as we discussed current projects. The assessment data from this year's pilot showed significant impact on both academic outcomes and college application rates. "That's impressive given the relatively modest resource investment," Miguel observed, his financial analyst's perspective now complementing rather than dismissing educational expertise. "Is scaling requiring additional administrative infrastructure?" The question reflected evolved understanding, recognizing that success metrics extended beyond simple cost-benefit analysis to include sustainability considerations often overlooked in corporate assessment models. Rather than suggesting more efficient alternatives based on business paradigms, he sought to understand educational implementation within its appropriate context. "We're implementing a tiered coordination model," I explained. "Former participants returning as peer mentors with faculty supervision, creating leadership development opportunities alongside the academic support components." "Smart design," Sophia commented with professional appreciation. "Building advancement, pathways into the program structure itself, rather than treating leadership as entirely separate function." This integrated conversation, where business perspectives informed rather than dominated educational considerations, represented precisely the balance I had hoped might eventually emerge from our confrontation. Not subordination of one domain to another, but recognition that different forms of expertise offer complementary insight when engaged with appropriate respect for their distinct value. As dinner concluded and the girls helped clear the table, household responsibilities being shared rather than assigned based on gendered expectations, Miguel mentioned a proposal that suggested continuing evolution in how he conceptualized both our relationship and my professional identity. The firm is organizing a symposium on intergenerational wealth transfer next quarter, he explained. The planning committee has been discussing keynote speakers who might address the non-financial dimensions of legacy planning, particularly how values transmission occurs alongside asset distribution. I suggested you might offer valuable perspective based on both your educational background and the Foundation's approach to community impact. The invitation represented significant shift from the diminished identity he had once assigned me. Rather than positioning me as extension of domestic service or recipient of paternalistic guidance, he now recognized specific expertise I might contribute to professional contexts he valued. Most importantly, this recognition extended beyond our private reconciliation to public acknowledgement of my continued professional relevance despite retirement from formal teaching positions. That's an interesting possibility, I responded, neither immediately accepting nor declining, but considering the proposal with appropriate professional assessment. I'd want to review the symposium's overall framework and objectives before determining whether my perspective would be genuinely valuable to the intended audience. Of course, he agreed readily. I'll have my assistant send the complete program materials for your consideration. The committee chairs would be happy to discuss specific focus areas if you're potentially interested. The exchange demonstrated healthy recalibration of our relationship, professional courtesy balanced with familial connection, neither dimension superseding the other in inappropriate contexts. Before the contract confrontation, he might have either dismissed my potential contribution entirely or assumed my participation based on maternal obligation. This measured proposal and my equally measured response reflected more authentic engagement, based on mutual respect rather than unconscious hierarchy. Later that evening, as the family prepared to depart after a pleasant gathering unmarked by tension or performative reconciliation, Miguel lingered briefly for a more private conversation, while Sophia helped the girls gather their belongings. I've been reflecting on something that continues to challenge my thinking, he began with uncharacteristic hesitation. How easily everyone at that business meeting accepted the introduction without question, not just my misrepresentation, but the entire paradigm it reflected about who serves and who is served in professional contexts. The observation revealed continuing process rather than completed transformation, not merely correcting individual behavior, but examining the systems that normalized such behavior without conscious awareness. Rather than immediate response, I allowed space for him to develop this emerging understanding. It's made me increasingly attentive to similar patterns throughout our industry, he continued thoughtfully. The invisible support labor that maintains professional environments, cleaning staff entering offices before dawn, administrative personnel managing complex logistics without recognition, facilities workers maintaining infrastructure without acknowledgement. People with names and lives and expertise rendered functionally invisible because their contributions don't register within conventional success metrics. This extension, from personal recognition regarding one relationship to systemic awareness of broader patterns, represented the most significant evolution since our confrontation. Without romanticizing what remained a work in progress, I acknowledged the value of this developing perception. Visibility and invisibility are manufactured conditions rather than natural states, I observed. Systems create specific forms of recognition while rendering other contributions functionally unacknowledged despite their essential nature. He nodded, the brief exchange reflecting mutual understanding that didn't require elaborate explanation or emotional performance. As they departed with warm familial goodbyes rather than formal business conclusions, I reflected on the journey from that moment of casual dismissal to our current recalibrated relationship. My son had introduced me as the maid, revealing patterns of diminishment too easily dismissed as innocent oversight. I had said nothing in that moment, choosing strategic response over immediate confrontation. Then I had handed him a contract that transformed abstract disrespect into tangible consequences, requiring genuine engagement. The outcome wasn't perfect resolution or complete transformation, but something more realistic and ultimately more valuable: recognition of patterns that extended beyond our individual relationship into institutional structures affecting many others. The months following the scholarship ceremony brought continuing evidence of this extended impact. Miguel's firm implemented policy changes regarding recognition and compensation for support staff, establishing more equitable practices that acknowledged contributions previously rendered invisible within corporate culture. Sophia mentioned these developments during one of our regular lunch meetings, occasions that had evolved from obligatory family maintenance to genuinely enjoyable professional exchange between women with different but complementary expertise. The administrative team seems genuinely surprised by the recent changes, she observed as we discussed organizational culture. Not just the compensation adjustments, which were overdue, but the structural inclusion in certain planning processes where their perspective offers valuable insight typically overlooked by management. Visibility often requires structural implementation rather than merely individual intention, I noted. Systems maintain specific patterns of recognition, regardless of personal awareness, unless deliberately reconfigured to incorporate different values. She nodded thoughtfully before adding, Miguel mentioned that your contract was the catalyst for his reevaluation of these issues. Something about how easily he had accepted certain hierarchies as natural until experiencing a moment of recognition that revealed their constructed nature. The acknowledgement confirmed what I had hoped when choosing strategic confrontation over either silent acceptance or emotional reaction, that boundaries established through formal agreement might create necessary space for recognition that extended beyond our immediate relationship. The contract that had initially seemed disproportionate response to a single thoughtless moment had ultimately catalyzed examination of systemic patterns affecting many lives beyond our family context. This broader impact became increasingly evident through subtle but significant organizational changes that Miguel implemented within his firm over the following year. The company's charitable foundation shifted from traditional donor-centered philanthropy toward more collaborative community partnerships with shared decision-making structures. Their hiring practices evolved to recognize diverse forms of expertise, rather than prioritizing credentials from narrowly defined prestigious institutions. Most notably, their client services began explicitly acknowledging the contributions of support personnel, rather than maintaining the fiction that executives functioned without essential assistance from administrative teams. None of these changes could be attributed solely to our confrontation, of course. Organizational transformation emerges through complex interactions between individual awareness, institutional pressures, and broader social movements. But the timing suggested that our personal reckoning had indeed contributed to accelerated evolution within systems where Miguel exercised significant influence, evidence that individual confrontations sometimes create ripple effects extending far beyond their immediate context. Perhaps the most meaningful extension occurred approximately 18 months after the original incident, when Miguel invited me to participate in a panel discussion his firm was hosting on invisible labor and institutional recognition. The event brought together corporate leadership, academic researchers, support staff representatives, and community advocates to examine how organizational structures create specific patterns of visibility and compensation that often fail to reflect essential contributions to institutional functioning. My participation wasn't positioned as maternal support for my son's initiative, but as specific professional contribution based on decades of educational administration experience, recognition of expertise that extended beyond family relationship to acknowledgement of continued professional relevance despite formal retirement. The panel composition itself reflected evolved understanding, with support staff representatives included as essential knowledge holders rather than token participants in discussions that directly affected their working conditions. During the discussion, Miguel referenced our personal experience without specific details that might have seemed exploitative of family dynamics for professional performance. A personal interaction approximately 18 months ago forced me to recognize how easily I had accepted certain hierarchies as natural, despite their clearly constructed nature, he acknowledged. That recognition prompted examination of similar patterns throughout our organizational structure. Who remains visible in decision-making processes, whose contributions receive acknowledgement, how compensation reflects or fails to reflect essential value to institutional functioning. The acknowledgement represented appropriate integration of personal insight into professional context, neither oversharing private dynamics nor pretending organizational changes emerged solely from abstract principles rather than concrete experience. My own contributions to the discussion drew on educational administration experience rather than personal relationship, maintaining professional boundaries while demonstrating continued engagement with institutional analysis despite formal retirement. From academic positions. Following the panel, several participants approached me with questions specifically related to implementing recognition structures within educational institutions, evidence that my expertise remained relevant beyond the family context that had initially prompted my inclusion. Rather than being defined primarily through relationship to my son's professional initiatives, I was engaged as independent contributor with specific valuable perspective based on distinct professional experience. This multidimensional engagement, neither exclusively professional nor merely familial, but integration of different relationship aspects in appropriate contexts, represented the healthiest outcome I could have hoped for when confronting the diminishment that had characterized Miguel's unconscious treatment. Not perfect resolution or complete transformation, but ongoing evolution toward more authentic recognition of complex personhood beyond convenient categorization. The most meaningful evidence of this evolution emerged through ordinary interactions, rather than dramatic moments or formal acknowledgments. When introducing me to new colleagues or clients, Miguel now consistently used accurate identification, my mother, Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, with neither elaborate credential recitation nor complete omission of professional identity. Family gatherings included natural integration of professional updates alongside personal developments, without artificial separation between these domains or hierarchical valuation of certain contributions over others. Perhaps most significantly, conversations about my living arrangements and future planning shifted from paternalistic concern to collaborative discussion based on mutual respect for different forms of expertise. When legitimate health considerations eventually warranted modification to certain household arrangements 2 years later, Miguel approached these conversations with fundamentally different framework than he would have employed before our confrontation. I've been researching home modification options that might address the mobility issues while maintaining your independence here, he mentioned during a visit following my minor knee surgery. There are several companies specializing in historical properties that understand how to integrate accessibility features without compromising architectural integrity. Would you be interested in scheduling consultations to explore possibilities? The approach reflected complete transformation from his previous attitude, offering information and resources rather than directive guidance, recognizing my decision-making, authority, rather than assuming managerial responsibility, suggesting modifications to physical environment rather than relocation from meaningful space. Most importantly, it acknowledged that independence constituted essential quality of life, dimension rather than merely sentimental attachment to impractical arrangements. My response reflected parallel evolution in our relationship dynamic, neither defensively rejecting legitimate concerns nor surrendering autonomous decision-making to external authority. That seems worthwhile exploring, I acknowledged. The Foundation Board has actually been discussing accessibility improvements that would benefit both my current needs and future program participants. Perhaps we could coordinate assessments to address both personal and organizational requirements simultaneously. This integrated approach, addressing legitimate practical considerations while maintaining respect for autonomous decision-making. And meaningful purpose represented precisely the balance that had been missing in his earlier attempts to manage my aging process according to conventional assumptions rather than individual circumstances. Not dismissal of legitimate aging considerations, but incorporation of these realities into continued purposeful engagement rather than supervised decline. The home modifications implemented following these consultations reflected this balanced perspective, changes that enhanced safety and accessibility while preserving both architectural integrity and functional independence. Bathroom renovations incorporated elegant grab bars that complemented historic fixtures rather than imposing institutional appearance. Kitchen adjustments improved accessibility while maintaining the cooking functionality that remained important to my identity and family gatherings. A discreet elevator installation provided alternative to stairs when necessary, while preserving the magnificent central staircase that constituted significant architectural feature. Most importantly, these modifications supported continued foundation activities rather than merely personal comfort, accessibility improvements benefiting program participants with mobility challenges, elevator access expanding usable educational spaces, kitchen enhancements facilitating community gatherings that remained central to the foundation's mission. Physical adaptations supported purpose rather than merely extending occupation, maintaining meaningful engagement rather than passive residence. Miguel's participation in this process demonstrated continuing evolution in his perspective. Genuine collaboration based on complementary expertise, rather than either controlling management or complete detachment. His financial and project management experience proved valuable in contractor negotiations and implementation oversight, while his newfound awareness of accessibility considerations informed technical specifications beyond merely aesthetic preservation. These practical contributions remained bounded by appropriate respect for my decision-making authority, while offering genuinely valuable assistance that enhanced outcomes for all involved. This balanced engagement, offering expertise without imposing control, acknowledging legitimate considerations without assuming management authority, extended to other aspects of our evolving relationship as my aging progressed. When minor health challenges emerged, Miguel provided information and resources without presumptive intervention. When foundation activities required adaptation to changing physical capabilities, he offered strategic suggestions while respecting established organizational structures. When grandparenting responsibilities shifted with the girls' developing needs, he facilitated meaningful engagement that accommodated changing energy levels while maintaining significant relationship quality. Throughout these evolving circumstances, the fundamental respect established through our confrontation maintained appropriate boundaries that supported continuing relationship development rather than reversion to problematic patterns under stress. The contract that had formalized consequences for disrespect created foundation for sustained recognition that withstood changing circumstances rather than collapsing under pressure into familiar diminishment patterns. 5 years after that pivotal moment when my son introduced me as Maria to his business associates, I celebrated my 75th birthday surrounded by family, colleagues, former students, and foundation participants whose lives had been touched by my continuing engagement, despite formal retirement from institutional positions. The gathering, hosted at the Vernon house that had catalyzed our confrontation, represented perfect integration of personal and professional dimensions, acknowledgement of multifaceted identity rather than reduction to convenient categorization. During the celebration, Miguel offered toast that reflected how profoundly his perspective had evolved since that moment of casual dismissal. Without referencing specific details of our private confrontation, he acknowledged the broader impact of reconsidering fundamental assumptions about visibility, contribution, and recognition. My mother has taught many lessons throughout her distinguished career, he began. But perhaps the most valuable has been demonstrating that respect requires sustained attention rather than merely good intentions. That meaningful recognition sees people in their full complexity, rather than through convenient categories that serve our immediate purposes. That legacy consists not in what we leave behind, but in how we transform systems to recognize value, previously rendered invisible. The statement captured precisely what our confrontation had ultimately produced, not merely corrected behavior within one relationship, but expanded awareness that extended to institutional structures affecting many others. The contract that had seemed disproportionate response to a single thoughtless moment had catalyzed examination of patterns typically dismissed as natural, despite their clearly constructed nature. My response acknowledged this journey without excessive sentimentality or performance of reconciliation. The most meaningful education often occurs through moments that challenge comfortable assumptions, I observed. True learning requires willingness to recognize patterns previously accepted without examination, and courage to implement changes that align systems with values rather than merely proclaiming principles without structural support. This exchange reflected healthy integration of our confrontation into continuing relationship development, neither defining our connection exclusively through that pivotal moment, nor pretending it hadn't fundamentally altered our understanding of both personal and institutional patterns. The difficult boundary setting had created necessary space for recognition that informal understanding had failed to maintain, ultimately benefiting many beyond our immediate relationship. As evening concluded and guests departed with warm farewells, Miguel lingered briefly for more private conversation, while Sophia helped the girls gather their belongings. Now 17, the twins had developed into thoughtful young women with distinct perspectives and emerging professional interests, Lucia pursuing scientific research that combined technical precision with social impact, Isabella developing artistic practice that explored themes of visibility and recognition through documentary photography. "I've been reflecting on something that continues to challenge my thinking," Miguel commented as we watched the girls engage with former students who had become respected professionals in their own right. How completely I had accepted certain frameworks about aging, expertise, and authority without recognizing their constructed nature. How easily convenience becomes justification for diminishment that serves immediate purposes while undermining deeper values. The observation revealed continuing process rather than completed transformation, ongoing examination rather than settled conclusion. This developmental orientation represented perhaps the most valuable outcome of our confrontation, creating foundation for sustained evolution rather than merely corrected behavior within fixed understanding. Recognition remains active practice, rather than achieved state, I acknowledged. Systems continuously reproduce certain patterns of visibility and valuation unless deliberately examined and reconfigured according to different principles. He nodded thoughtfully before adding, "The scholarship recipients are organizing alumni network focusing specifically on educational leadership pathways. They've asked if you would consider serving as advisory mentor during the initial development phase. Your experience establishing sustainable organizational structures would be particularly valuable as they create governance frameworks." The invitation reflected perfect integration of respect for continuing professional contribution, alongside acknowledgement of evolving capabilities, meaningful engagement adapted to changing circumstances rather than either dismissal of relevant expertise or disregard for practical limitations. Not performance of reconciliation, but authentic recognition of multidimensional identity beyond convenient categorization. "That seems like worthwhile engagement," I responded, neither automatically accepting based on obligation, nor reflexively declining based on independence assertion. "I'd want to discuss specific expectations and time commitments before making final decision, but the initiative sounds promising." This measured exchange, professional consideration balanced with personal connection, neither dimension inappropriately dominating the other, demonstrated how completely our relationship had recalibrated since that moment of casual dismissal 5 years earlier. Not perfect resolution or complete transformation, but ongoing evolution toward more authentic engagement based on mutual respect rather than unconscious hierarchy. As they departed with warm, familial goodbyes rather than formal conclusions, I reflected on the journey from that pivotal confrontation to our current relationship. My son had introduced me as the maid, revealing patterns of diminishment too, easily dismissed as innocent oversight. I had said nothing in that moment, choosing strategic response over immediate reaction. Then I had handed him a contract that transformed abstract disrespect into tangible consequences requiring genuine engagement. The outcome wasn't dramatic reconciliation or perfect understanding, but something more valuable and ultimately more sustainable. Recognition of patterns that extended beyond our individual relationship into institutional structures affecting many others. The boundary established through formal agreement had created necessary space for recognition that informal understanding had failed to maintain, ultimately benefiting countless others through transformed organizational practices and resource allocations. Sometimes respect must be taught through consequences, when examples and expectations have somehow failed to convey the message, not with anger or vindictiveness, but with clear boundaries that mirror back the reality of how one person has chosen to see another, and the cost of continuing to maintain that distorted vision when reality demonstrates otherwise. The contract, that seemed so dramatic when presented, had ultimately served purpose far beyond our family dynamics, creating ripple effects that continued transforming systems long after our initial confrontation had resolved into more authentic relationship. My son had introduced me as the maid, convenient. Categorization that served immediate purposes while revealing unconscious patterns of diminishment. I had said nothing in that moment, choosing strategic response over reactive confrontation. Then I had handed him a contract that transformed abstract disrespect into tangible consequences requiring genuine engagement. The resulting journey had ultimately led not merely to corrected behavior, but to transformed perspective that benefited many beyond our immediate relationship. Evidence that sometimes the most valuable lessons emerge from moments we would never have chosen but cannot afford to waste. 10 years had passed since that pivotal moment when Miguel introduced me as Maria at a business meeting in my own home. A decade of gradual evolution rather than dramatic transformation, of relationship, recalibration rather than perfect resolution. At 80, I found myself in circumstances I could not have anticipated when handing him that contract in the lawyer's office. Not because aging had diminished my capabilities as conventional wisdom might have predicted, but because life continues presenting unexpected dimensions regardless of careful planning. The Vernon House still served as headquarters for the Eleanor Vasquez Education Access Initiative, its elegant rooms hosting scholarship programs, mentorship, activities, and community education events. The modifications implemented over the years had enhanced accessibility while preserving architectural integrity, allowing continued foundation operations alongside my gradually changing physical capabilities. What had begun as personal confrontation over respect and recognition had evolved into sustainable institution that would continue its mission beyond my individual participation. The most unexpected development during this decade emerged not through my relationship with Miguel, but through my granddaughter's evolving perspectives as they transitioned from children to independent young adults. The twins, now 21, had followed distinctly different paths that nonetheless reflected complementary dimensions of values transmitted across generations despite changing forms. Lucia had pursued scientific education at a prestigious research university, her methodical mind finding expression in environmental systems analysis that integrated technical expertise with social impact considerations. Isabella had chosen art school, developing documentary photography practice that explored themes of visibility and recognition across different communities. Though their professional orientations differed dramatically, both demonstrated commitment to making visible what conventional frameworks often rendered unseen, whether Environmental impacts typically externalized from economic calculations or human contributions, systematically excluded from institutional recognition. This values transmission across generations, modified through individual interpretation rather than rigid replication, represented perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the confrontation that had forced recognition of dismissive patterns within our family system. The Maria incident had catalyzed examination that ultimately transformed not just Miguel's perspective, but institutional practices that would influence many lives beyond our immediate relationship. My relationship with Miguel had stabilized into respectful engagement that neither erased our difficult history nor remained defined exclusively by that pivotal confrontation. Our interactions balanced appropriate professional boundaries with genuine familial connection, neither dimension inappropriately dominating the other in specific contexts. When legitimate aging considerations required practical adaptations, he offered information and resources without presumptive intervention. When foundation activities benefited from his financial expertise, he provided valuable consultation while respecting established organizational structures. When health challenges occasionally necessitated additional support, he arranged assistance without undermining autonomy or assuming management authority. The evolution in this relationship appeared perhaps most clearly during a specific weekend, gathering at the Vernon house approximately 10 years after our initial confrontation. The occasion marked multiple intersecting milestones: my 80th birthday, the Foundation's 10th anniversary, and Isabella's first major photography exhibition, focusing on invisible labor in institutional contexts. These convergent celebrations brought together family members, Foundation participants, former students, and community partners in gathering that integrated personal and professional dimensions without artificial separation. Miguel arrived early. That morning, not to manage arrangements according to his preferences, but to offer specific assistance with technological setup for presentations scheduled throughout the day. His approach reflected complete transformation from previous patterns, offering expertise within bounded parameters rather than assuming general authority, supporting existing plans rather than implementing alternative arrangements, engaging as participant within established structure rather than external manager imposing direction. The presentation system is configured for both the scholarship announcements and Isabella's exhibition preview, he confirmed as we reviewed final preparations in the main gallery space. The Foundation staff handled most components, but I adjusted some settings to accommodate the specific visual requirements Isabella mentioned for her documentary series. This collaborative engagement, contributing specific expertise while respecting established arrangements, demonstrated how completely our relationship had recalibrated since that moment when he had casually dismissed my identity for convenience in a business context. Not perfect understanding or dramatic reconciliation, but functional recalibration that maintained appropriate boundaries while allowing meaningful connection. As guests arrived throughout the morning, I observed Miguel's interactions with various participants, scholarship recipients, Foundation board members, community partners, former students who had become respected professionals in their own fields. His engagement reflected genuine interest rather than performative philanthropy, authentic recognition of diverse contributions rather than hierarchical valuation based on conventional metrics. He had learned to see people in their full complexity rather than through convenient categories that served immediate purposes. The fundamental lesson our confrontation had ultimately taught through its ripple effects beyond our immediate relationship. The most revealing moment occurred during informal gathering before formal presentations began. One of the catering staff, an older immigrant woman supervising food service arrangements, approached with question about additional seating requirements. Rather than dismissive instruction or casual disregard, Miguel engaged with same respectful attention he extended to Foundation board members and university administrators also present at the event. "Ms. Rosario, thank you for checking on this," he acknowledged, using her actual name rather than generic designation or convenient fabrication. The Foundation director mentioned possible additional guests. Let me connect you directly with her to confirm final arrangements rather than creating confusion through intermediate communication. This brief interaction, unremarkable in its specific content but revealing in its approach, demonstrated how completely his perspective had evolved regarding those conventional frameworks might position as merely functional rather than fully recognized. The woman wasn't the caterer or convenient fabrication serving immediate purpose, but specific individual with name, identity, and appropriate professional acknowledgement. Not performance for audience benefit, but consistent practice reflecting genuine perspective shift over years of deliberate attention. Later that afternoon, as formal presentations began in the main gallery, Miguel introduced scholarship recipients with specific recognition of their individual accomplishments rather than generic acknowledgement or self-congratulatory donor perspective. His remarks positioned the Foundation's support as enabling opportunity for talent already present, rather than creating capacity through benevolent intervention. Subtle but significant distinction reflecting evolved understanding about recognition and contribution. These exceptional students bring perspectives and capabilities our educational institutions and communities desperately need, he noted during his brief remarks. The Foundation's role isn't creating their potential, but removing artificial barriers that might otherwise prevent their contributions from reaching full expression. Their success represents not exceptional achievement, despite circumstances, but systemic adjustment toward more accurate recognition of capability that exists throughout our communities, regardless of conventional credentialing pathways. This framework, acknowledging systemic patterns rather than merely celebrating individual exceptions, demonstrated how completely his perspective had evolved since our confrontation forced examination of assumptions previously accepted without conscious awareness. Not merely corrected behavior within one relationship, but expanded understanding that influenced institutional practices affecting many others through his professional position and resource allocation authority. The exhibition preview that followed. These presentations revealed parallel evolution in my granddaughter's perspectives, particularly Isabella's artistic practice focusing explicitly on visibility and recognition themes. Her photographic series documented workers typically rendered invisible within institutional contexts, maintenance staff entering buildings before dawn, administrative personnel managing complex logistics without acknowledgement, support workers, enabling professional functions while remaining systematically uncredited in institutional narratives. The images themselves were technically impressive, demonstrating considerable artistic skill in composition and execution. But their significance extended beyond aesthetic quality to conceptual framework that deliberately challenged conventional visibility patterns through careful attention to what systems typically render unseen, despite essential contribution. These weren't sentimental portrayals of noble working-class struggle, but sophisticated examination of how institutional structures create specific recognition patterns that often fail to reflect actual operational requirements and contributions. During her brief artist statement, Isabella acknowledged influences that had shaped this project's development. My interest in visibility patterns and institutional recognition emerged partially through family experiences that revealed how easily convenience becomes justification for dismissal, she noted with appropriate discretion regarding specific details. These photographs attempt to make visible not just individuals whose contributions often remain unacknowledged, but the systematic patterns that normalize such invisibility despite operational dependence on these essential functions. The acknowledgement represented perfect integration of personal experience into professional development, without inappropriate disclosure or exploitation of family dynamics for performance purposes. Her artistic practice had incorporated insights from our family's difficult journey, without becoming defined exclusively through that specific context. Evidence that values transmission occurs through complex integration rather than rigid replication. Across generations, Miguel's response to his daughter's work revealed parallel evolution in his perspective. genuine engagement with challenging content rather than defensive reaction to implicit critique of systems where he maintained significant influence. During gallery conversations following formal presentations, I overheard him discussing specific images with other attendees, his observations reflecting sophisticated understanding of the institutional patterns being examined rather than superficial appreciation or deflective interpretation. What struck me most about this series is how institutional design itself creates these visibility patterns regardless of individual awareness or intention. He commented to university administrator viewing images of maintenance workers arriving before dawn. Systems establish specific recognition frameworks that persist unless deliberately reconfigured according to different values, regardless of personal goodwill or individual acknowledgement efforts. This observation, recognizing systemic dimensions beyond individual behavior, demonstrated how completely his perspective had evolved since our confrontation forced examination of patterns previously accepted without conscious awareness. Not merely corrected actions within specific relationships, but fundamental reconsideration of frameworks that shape institutional practices across multiple contexts. Later that evening, as formal activities concluded and gatherings shifted toward more intimate family celebration, Miguel found opportunity for brief private conversation while others prepared dinner arrangements. His expression suggested reflection rather than performance, continuing process rather than completed transformation. "I was thinking earlier about how completely that contract changed everything," he commented as we watched Isabella adjusting lighting for evening documentation of her exhibition. "Not just our relationship, but my entire framework for recognition and visibility across multiple contexts. It created consequences that couldn't be dismissed as emotional overreaction or generational sensitivity. The acknowledgement required neither elaborate response nor emotional reassurance, simple recognition of shared understanding developed through difficult journey that had ultimately benefited many beyond our immediate relationship. Strategic confrontation creates opportunity for recognition that might remain unavailable through more conventional approaches," I observed, "particularly regarding patterns so normalized they've become functionally invisible without deliberate examination." He nodded thoughtfully before adding, "Isabella's exhibition makes visible exactly those patterns I couldn't see until specific circumstances forced recognition. The consistent thread through her work, how convenience becomes justification for dismissal that serves immediate purposes while undermining deeper values. That insight emerged directly from our family experience, but has extended far beyond that specific context. This acknowledgement, recognizing intergenerational transmission of values without claiming credit or imposing interpretation, represented perhaps the healthiest possible outcome from our difficult journey. Not perfect understanding or dramatic reconciliation, but thoughtful integration of challenging experience into evolving perspective that influenced both personal interactions and institutional practices. The Foundation Scholarship recipients, moving confidently through the celebration, engaging with board members and community partners as valued participants rather than grateful beneficiaries. The catering staff receiving appropriate recognition and inclusion rather than functional invisibility, despite essential contribution to the event's success. The maintenance personnel acknowledged by name rather than generic designation or convenient fabrication. These subtle but significant interactions represented the ripple effects of a confrontation that had forced examination of patterns typically dismissed as natural despite their clearly constructed nature. As evening progressed into informal dinner gathering that integrated professional colleagues with family members without artificial separation between these domains, I found myself reflecting on the decade-long journey since that pivotal moment when Miguel introduced me as Maria to his business associates. The contract that had seemed disproportionate response to thoughtless moment had ultimately catalyzed examination that transformed not just our relationship, but institutional practices affecting many others through evolved perspective and resource allocation decisions. Most significantly, this transformation had influenced the next generation through values transmission that manifested in both granddaughters' professional orientations despite their distinctly different paths. Lucia's environmental systems analysis focused explicitly on making visible ecological impacts typically externalized from economic calculations, recognition patterns that parallel the institutional visibility frameworks Isabella's documentary practice examined through artistic means. Different methodologies serving complementary purposes, both challenging conventional frameworks that determine what remains seen or unseen within established systems. The most unexpected dimension of this intergenerational impact emerged later, that evening, when Lucia shared news regarding professional development that connected directly to values underlying our family's difficult journey. As dinner concluded and conversations shifted toward more personal updates, she mentioned research fellowship she had recently accepted focusing specifically on quantifying systematically undervalued contributions to institutional functioning. The project examines how conventional metrics fail to capture essential operational components because they don't align with established recognition frameworks, she explained with characteristic precision. We're developing alternative assessment, models that incorporate traditionally invisible contributions into formal valuation systems rather than merely acknowledging them rhetorically without structural adjustment. This research orientation, making measurable what systems typically render unmeasurable despite essential contribution, represented perfect complementarity to Isabella's artistic practice, documenting similar patterns through visual rather than quantitative means. Different methodologies serving aligned purpose across distinct professional domains, evidence that values transmission occurs through integration rather than replication across generations. Miguel's response to his daughter's professional development revealed how completely his perspective had evolved since our confrontation, forced examination of patterns previously accepted without conscious awareness. Rather than dismissing alternative metrics as impractical idealism or suggesting conventional frameworks served legitimate efficiency purposes, he engaged with genuine interest regarding methodological approaches and potential applications across diverse institutional contexts. Have you considered how these alternative assessment models might apply within financial institutions specifically? He asked with professional interest rather than paternal direction. The investment evaluation frameworks our industry employs systematically externalize certain impacts while amplifying others based on what existing metrics render measurable. This engagement, recognizing potential application within his own professional domain rather than maintaining separation between idealistic research and practical implementation, demonstrated continuing evolution rather than completed transformation or compartmentalized adaptation. Not perfect understanding or dramatic conversion, but ongoing process integrating new awareness into established contexts where his influence affected resource allocation and institutional practices. As evening concluded and family members departed, with warm farewells rather than formal goodbyes, I found myself reflecting on the journey from that moment of casual dismissal to the rich intergenerational transmission evident in this gathering. My son had introduced me as the maid, revealing patterns of diminishment too easily dismissed as innocent oversight. I had said nothing in that moment, choosing strategic response over immediate reaction. Then I had handed him a contract that transformed abstract disrespect into tangible consequences requiring genuine engagement. The outcome wasn't perfect resolution or complete transformation, but something ultimately more valuable. Recognition of patterns that extended beyond our individual relationship into institutional structures affecting many others. The boundary established through formal agreement had created necessary space for recognition that informal understanding had failed to maintain, ultimately benefiting countless others through transformed perspectives and resource allocations. Most significantly, this evolution had influenced the next generation through values transmission that manifested in both granddaughters' professional orientations despite their distinctly different paths. The contract that had seemed disproportionate response to thoughtless moment had ultimately catalyzed examination that continued producing ripple effects a decade later, through institutional practices, resource allocations, and intergenerational values transmission appearing in unexpected contexts. The following morning, as cleanup activities concluded and exhibition preparations continued for public opening later that week, Miguel lingered briefly for final conversation before returning to professional obligations. His expression suggested continuing reflection rather than completed process, integration rather than compartmentalization of challenging insights across different life domains. "I've been thinking about something that continues challenging my perspective," he began with characteristic thoughtfulness. "How different our family trajectory might have been if you had chosen more conventional response to that moment of disrespect. Either immediate confrontation that would have created temporary discomfort but allowed quick resolution, or silent acceptance that would have maintained comfortable patterns while enabling continued diminishment." The observation revealed sophisticated understanding regarding strategic confrontation's specific value in addressing deeply embedded patterns that resist conventional correction approaches. Rather than immediately responding, I allowed space for him to develop this emerging insight. The contract created consequences that couldn't be dismissed as emotional overreaction or generational sensitivity. He continued after momentary reflection. It transformed abstract disrespect into tangible results, requiring genuine engagement rather than superficial acknowledgement or temporary behavior adjustment. That approach forced examination of patterns that might otherwise have continued despite occasional surface corrections. This recognition, understanding strategic confrontation's specific utility in addressing systemic patterns rather than merely individual behaviors, represented sophisticated integration of our experience into broader framework regarding institutional change processes. Not perfect understanding or dramatic reconciliation, but thoughtful incorporation of challenging experience into evolving perspective that influenced both personal interactions and professional practices. Sometimes conventional responses maintain problematic patterns precisely because they're easily incorporated without fundamental reconsideration, I acknowledged. Strategic confrontation creates consequences that require genuine examination rather than merely symbolic acknowledgement or temporary adjustment. He nodded thoughtfully before offering observation that captured our decade-long journey's essence with remarkable precision. What seemed disproportionate response to thoughtless moment ultimately created opportunity for recognition that might have remained unavailable through more moderate approaches. Not because individuals are deliberately resistant to change, but because systems maintain specific patterns regardless of personal awareness, unless deliberately reconfigured according to different values. This understanding, recognizing systemic dimensions beyond individual intention, represented perhaps the most valuable outcome from our difficult journey. Not perfect resolution or complete transformation, but evolved perspective that influenced institutional practices, affecting many lives beyond our immediate relationship, through changed resource allocations and recognition frameworks. As he prepared to depart with warm familial goodbye rather than formal conclusion, Miguel offered final observation that suggested continuing process rather than completed transformation. "I'm still discovering assumptions that have shaped my perception without conscious awareness," he acknowledged. "Still recognizing patterns previously accepted as natural despite their clearly constructed nature. That ongoing examination represents perhaps the most valuable outcome from what began as painful confrontation over casual dismissal." The statement captured precisely what our journey had ultimately produced. Not merely corrected behavior within one relationship, but expanded awareness that continued developing through deliberate attention to previously unexamined frameworks. Not dramatic conversion or perfect understanding, but ongoing evolution toward more authentic engagement, based on recognition rather than convenience or conventional expectation. After Miguel's departure, I remained briefly in the gallery surrounded by Isabella's powerful images documenting workers typically rendered invisible within institutional contexts. The photographs made visible precisely those patterns our family confrontation had ultimately challenged. How systems create specific recognition frameworks that often fail to reflect essential contributions when convenience becomes justification for dismissal serving immediate purposes. This artistic expression, emerging from granddaughter whose perspective had been shaped by our family's difficult journey without being defined exclusively through that experience, represented, perhaps, the most meaningful outcome from confrontation that began with personal dignity, but extended to benefit many beyond our immediate relationship. Not perfect resolution or complete transformation, but values transmission across generations that would continue influencing institutional practices long after our individual participation had concluded. As I prepared for the exhibition's public opening scheduled later that week, I reflected on the journey from that moment when my son introduced me as Maria to his business associates in my own home. The contract that had formalized consequences for this dismissal had ultimately served purpose far beyond our immediate relationship, creating ripple effects that continued transforming systems a decade later through changed resource allocations, recognition frameworks, and intergenerational values transmission. My son had introduced me as the maid, revealing patterns of diminishment too easily dismissed as innocent oversight. I had said nothing in that moment, choosing strategic response over immediate reaction. Then, I had handed him a contract that transformed abstract disrespect into tangible consequences requiring genuine engagement. The resulting journey had ultimately led not merely to corrected behavior, but to transformed perspectives that benefited many beyond our immediate relationship and would continue influencing institutional practices through next-generation values. Transmission long after our individual participation had concluded. Sometimes respect must be taught through consequences when examples and expectations have somehow failed to convey the message. Not with anger or vindictiveness, but with clear boundaries that mirror back the reality of how one person has chosen to see another, and the cost of continuing to maintain that distorted vision when reality demonstrates otherwise. The contract that had seemed disproportionate response to thoughtless moment had ultimately catalyzed examination of patterns typically dismissed as natural despite their clearly constructed nature, creating foundation for continuing evolution. Long after our initial confrontation had resolved into more authentic relationship, standing amid images that documented this ongoing work across institutional contexts, making visible what systems typically render unseen despite essential contribution, I recognized that our family's difficult journey had come full circle. The confrontation that began with personal dignity had extended to benefit many through institutional transformation, resource reallocation, and values transmission that would continue influencing recognition patterns long after our individual participation had concluded. Not perfect resolution or complete transformation, but lasting impact that extended far beyond what either of us could have anticipated when facing that pivotal moment of necessary truth a decade earlier. My son had introduced me as the maid, convenient, categorization that served immediate purposes while revealing unconscious patterns of diminishment. I had said nothing in that moment, choosing strategic response over reactive confrontation. Then I had handed him a contract that transformed abstract disrespect into tangible consequences requiring genuine engagement. The resulting journey had ultimately created legacy that would continue transforming systems long after our immediate confrontation had resolved. Evidence that sometimes the most meaningful impact emerges from moments we would never have chosen, but cannot afford to waste when fundamental respect requires strategic rather than conventional response. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.